In the heart of Tamriel, in what is today the province of Cyrodiil, going back to the beginning of the First Era, and before, lived weak and fragmented tribes of men. In those days, these men were subjects of elven rulers living in states of serfdom and chattel slavery. Eventually, the men of Cyrodiil broke from their bondage and beyond, defeating their elvish masters, going on themselves to lead empires of their own, these empires at times eclipsing all other contemporary polities. Today, the Third Empire of Man under the Septimian dynasty is indisputably the most powerful of these empires, holding dominion and sovereignty over all of Tamriel. Morrowind is a special and peculiar case versus all other Imperial provinces, as Morrowind is the only province to be acquired conditionally after negotiations. While it is still fair to say the legions won many great victories in their invasion of Morrowind, it is also fair to say they were unable to win the Great Victory, a decisive blow that would completely decapitate the leadership and will to fight of the province, as the Legion had delivered in other campaigns elsewhere. In Morrowind, the old ruling houses maintain their position of high status, and the living gods of the Tribunal continue as the spiritual leaders of the Dunmer people. At least, that's how the narrative is presented in Morrowind itself. In Outlander circles, particularly Imperial ones, the Dunmer maybe did not capitulate on paper, but in practice, Morrowind was broken just like all the other provinces. We'll get into the nuance of that eventually, as well as many other topics with the overall goal of explaining how the Imperial rule over Morrowind actually works. How does the Imperial system syncretize with Dunmer tradition? What value is Morrowind to the Imperial economy? In what way does the Legion maintain a presence? Several questions I hope to find the answers to. This video has been produced completely free of AI tools. I do all the writing, research, editing, and narration. So if you enjoy the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the video in the algorithm and shows your appreciation for my work. If you'd like to support me even more, check out my Patreon, where you can vote on upcoming video topics. This video was voted for by my very beautiful patrons. And finally, check out Tamriel Rebuilt and Project Tamriel. These mod projects have done a great job in expanding the world building of Elder Scrolls, and much of my work is based on their content. To explain how the Imperial government works in Morrowind, it's important to understand how the Imperial government functions in general. The Imperial government is based on the feudal system of Cyrodiil, which is fairly straightforward and similar to the hierarchical systems found in other provinces like Skyrim or High Rock. At the top of the power structure is the Emperor, which as of 3rd Era 427 is Uriel Septim VII. The single most powerful person in the known world. Swearing fealty to the Emperor are kings or queens, which before the time of the Empire were usually the highest-ranking figures in their respective political entities. Below a king will be dukes, and below them counts or other lower nobility of other titles. Sometimes these noble ranks have different names depending on the culture of a particular land. For instance, in Skyrim, a Jarl may be the equivalent in land and power to a count in Cyrodiil. Let's take the town of Brina Cross as an example. Brina Cross is a small settlement in the Kingdom of Anvil. The ruling noble family, the Hallgern, are marshals of Brina Cross and the surrounding area. The Hallgerns, in turn, are vassals to the Kingdom of Anvil, which themselves are vassals to the Emperor. It's all very simple. For the moment. It's going to get very convoluted once we start heading east. The Imperial system, however, is quite unique, as it does not simply add another brick to the tower by placing the Emperor at the top of existing kingdoms. The Empire actually has an additional chamber of government that can act perhaps not as a full-on check, but a stubborn roadblock to an Emperor's power. Below the Ruby Throne of the Emperor is the Elder Council. The Elder Council is not simply an advisory body, but also has a legislative role. This council, in one form or another, has roughly existed since the Elysian Empire, the first powerful empire of Cirids. The Elder Council is responsible for much of the less glamorous but very important affairs needed to make a government actually function properly. Taxation, construction works, judicial rulings, etc. Affairs deemed too tedious or minor for the Emperor broadly. Even though the Elder Council maintains a fair amount of privilege, any law they pass or ruling they give must be approved by the Emperor, as he retains absolute veto power. In some cases, an uncooperative council in itself can be a check on the Emperor's power. While the supremacy of the Emperor is never officially contested, a council unwilling to handle the mundane details of governance means an Emperor may have to waste energy on minor issues normally delegated to the council, distracting him from larger problems more suited for an Emperor's attention. It's considered proper and Emperor-like for a ruler to work fairly with the council. In the past, this has been an issue. Upon the death of Uriel IV, the council would not acknowledge any of his children as heirs to the throne, instead choosing a cousin, Sepphoris II. This led to a period of bloody civil war where battles raged even as far as Morrowind. It is in times where there is no emperor that the Elder Council's powers show their true weight and importance. Upon the death of an emperor, the council is responsible for acknowledging a successor. While in virtually every case of succession, a blood relative of the late emperor is chosen, the council has some discretion in which blood relative in particular will ascend to the Ruby Throne. In cases where there is no clear heir or the named emperor is unable to rule, perhaps being disabled or too young, the council's High Chancellor will act as regent. The High Chancellor in any circumstance acts as the leader of the council and appoints a deputy, the Chief Counselor, from among the members of the council. It is generally understood that counselors are appointed directly by the emperor. However, the council does seem to have influence in which candidates are presented for approval. The Elder Council is mostly composed of members of wealthy elite Cyrodiilic families, powerful battle mages, priests of the Imperial cult, and sometimes even vassals from provinces outside Cyrodiil, although the latter of those is rare. It must also be noted that the Elder Council is not permanently in session. A sort of quorum must be reached for the body to operate, as many counselors are often dealing with affairs at home or called off by the Emperor to handle important tasks away from the capital. In the absence of a session of the Elder Council, the Inner Council continues day-to-day operations. The Inner Council, a much smaller body headed by the High Chancellor, is always active and much closer to the Emperor. The members of the Inner Council are effectively the Emperor's closest advisors, and in theory have more power than the Elder Council. Its privileges are on a sort of need-to-know basis. Information they're not really willing to give out to people like us.
What's this about?
Nothing. Sorry. Now that we understand how the Imperial government works in overview, how does it work as it pertains to Morrowind specifically? In many cases, the Empire is not able to or does not wish to impose a one-for-one copy of the Cyrodiilic system in conquered territory. In many lands, especially so in the case of Morrowind, the Empire integrates itself into the native system in a balanced way. Not so imposing that the conquered peoples revolt, but enough that the Imperials can still tip the scales of power and profit in their favor. I mean, sometimes the Empire kinda does crush people so they can do whatever they want, But that didn't happen in Morrowind, so let's just not worry about it, okay? When Morrowind was absorbed by the Empire, the traditional Dunmer form of government and culture was kept mostly intact. The 5 great houses would maintain their wealth and positions of power with only some moderate concessions. The status of the living gods, Almalexia, Sothosil, and Vivek, would remain, and the dominance of the religion devoted to them upheld. However, there would still, of course, be some changes. In the past, the great houses were united under hortators like Induril Nerevar, but this title is more akin to a dictator rather than a monarch, a position held temporarily in times of war or other extreme circumstances. Under the hegemony of the Imperials, Morrowind would officially have a singular monarch. Emperor Tiber Septim named Berenzia Ra'atim of House Lalu as the Queen of Morrowind, who would be a vassal under the Emperor. Yes, I have it on good authority that might be how it's pronounced. I've only ever seen it written in books, so forgive me if it's something boring like Rothim. Queen Berenzia would marry Symmachus, a common Dunmer that rose through the ranks of the Legion to become one of Tiber Septim's most capable generals. Initially, Berenzia's title of queen was seen as ceremonial. The great houses exuded so much power, they remained largely autonomous. Even House Lalu continued to do things their own way, as the Ra'atim clan are not original members of House Lalu, but from a defunct House Mora, a once mighty house, later absorbed by Lalu when their power waned. For the great houses, despite now having a singular monarch, business continued as usual. The Dunmer nobles competed with each other as always, occasionally coming into a grand council to solve major issues. However, Queen Berenzia's role in Morrowind politics would not remain superfluous forever. Her loyalty to Tiber Septim's heirs and popularity with Dunmer commoners gradually increased her power and influence. But all the progress in building the Imperial monarchy of Morrowind would come crashing down during the turmoil of the Imperial simulacrum. In 3rd Era 391, a Dunmer rebellion captured Berenzia's seat of Mournhold when Legion troops deserted en masse after over a year without supplies and pay from the Imperial city. Queen Berenzia and her children fled to the Imperial city to seek support, but none was to be found. Symmachus, without a proper force to defend the city, was slain by the rebels shortly thereafter. The rebels named Berenzia's uncle, Athen-Lethen, as king, and Berenzia formally abdicated rights to Morrowind's throne. Lethen's right to rule was acknowledged by the as-of-yet undiscovered Yegar Tharn, the wicked mage who masqueraded as Emperor Uriel VII. Perhaps controversially, Lethen retained his position as king after the true emperor had been restored. Queen Berenzia's life story is quite interesting, but also extensive. Too much to talk about at the moment. But to summarize the rest of her story, she was remarried to the king of Wayrest in High Rock, and became instrumental in eventually foiling Yegar Tharn and ending the simulacrum. Fate, however, would bring the throne of Morrowind back to Berenzia's family. King Lethen died lacking a direct heir, the closest kin being his grandnephew Helseth, Berenzia's son by Symmachus. The rule of both Lethen and Helseth saw the prestige of Morrowind's imperial throne wane, the monarchs instead being seen more as imperial puppets. King Lethen reigned over the extremely unpopular decision by the Empire to revoke the exclusive Tribunal Temple mandate over the island of Vardenfell, which today is heavily colonized and exploited by Imperial settlers. Lethen's death and rise of King Helseth to the throne also has raised some suspicions. Some Dunmer believe the Imperials and House Lalu murdered Lethen for a more favorable monarch. While Dunmer by blood, Helseth was raised in High Rock, far removed from the culture and traditions of Morrowind. his mannerisms, speech, and style quite unfamiliar to the people he rules. While lacking a lot of true power, it is said by King Helseth's supporters and critics alike that he is a shrewd diplomat and makes use of what soft power he has fairly effectively. The main takeaway from all this is, yes, the Empire kind of does have a puppet monarch that theoretically rules over the whole province of Morrowind as an imperial vassal. But for various reasons we'll get into later, these monarchs have to bite and claw for any real power. They do get to live in a nice house and wear stunning robes, though. If you have a chat with a guard in any Dunmer settlement, occasionally they may mention they are an officer of Imperial law as much as they are one for their ancient house. Whether they say it with pride or through gritted teeth, it is true, regardless if you're in the foreign quarter of Narcissus or in the sacred city of Necrom. Imperial law holds jurisdiction over the entire province. While there is some yield to local laws, there is just as much, perhaps more, yielding the other way. In the opinion of the Ruby Throne, all those residing in Morrowind are Imperial subjects, which comes with plenty of obligations, like taxes and military service, but also comes with some benefits. In many Dunmer cities in Morrowind, you'll find a number of Imperial-leased buildings dedicated to exercising and sustaining the Empire's robust legal system. One example of such a building is the Imperial Commission in Balfoyen. This is a large, multi-purpose building that is sort of your one-stop shop for everything Imperial in Balfoyen. The Commission serves as a garrison for local Legion troops, a secure location to detain criminals, a place to access various records and legal texts, and in general a location to handle low-level legal cases. The building has a magistrate in residence who has the power to hear these cases and give rulings. In theory, settlers from the Imperial City and Dark Elves from the Ashlands of Vardenfell both have the same right to petition the magistrate in legal disputes. In this capacity, the Commission also serves as an important liaison between the native legal system of Morrowind and the Imperial system. As you may expect, not everything that is illegal in Cyrodiil is illegal in Morrowind, or vice versa. While some of those questions are outlined explicitly in the armistice, like the matter of slavery, it takes teams of scribes, clerks, and barristers to fill in the gaps and make rulings fairly. Far from idyllic in practice, there are many criticisms of Imperial law. In many corners of Morrowind, there is little to no foreign presence. Almost no obligation through economics or force for the Dunmer in these areas to consider Imperial law. Additionally, some view Imperial law as a way to slowly erode traditional Dunmer rights, a vessel to make Imperial control of the province more absolute. Things like gambling, usury, market speculation, and necromancy are illegal or frowned upon in some Dunmer locales, but protected under Imperial law. All of these local magistrates and commissions are, of course, not informed directly from the Imperial City or the Emperor personally. Morrowind's foremost judicial figure is the proconsul. In other areas of the Empire, a proconsul may have a wide range of powers, but in Morrowind, many of these privileges are yielded to the Dunmer or other Imperial institutions. The current proconsul of Morrowind is the Cyrodiilic nobleman Galvus Potreed, whose consulate sits in the council quarter of Narcissus. Galvus, a member of the Elder Council, is not exactly fond of his appointment to his current post, but he is loyal to the Emperor and yields to his commands. The Potreeds are an esteemed Imperial family with loyal service going back hundreds of years. In fact, one of Galvus's ancestors was the principal commander for Legion forces during the Imperial conquest of Elsewhere. Much like the lower magistrates, Proconsul Patrid makes decisions on legal rulings. Of course, the cases he deals with are of the highest sensitivity and importance. As he is a direct appointee of the Emperor, his legal opinions are to be treated as if they were the Emperor's own. The Proconsul also sees to various other important duties. He's the last, most important signature when it comes to payment, deployment, and logistics of Legion forces in the province. The consulate itself is an important headquarters for many arms of imperial power. High-ranking military commanders, members of Dunmer nobility, representatives of imperial trading companies, scholars, and agents of imperial intelligence services make a residence in the consulate, working closely with the proconsul. The most important legal document that Proconsul Patrid or any magistrate must consider is, of course, the armistice, signed by the living god Lord Vivek and Emperor Tiber Septim. To explain what the armistice is, we also need to examine historical imperial influence in Morrowind, from invasions by the Rimmon dynasty to Tiber Septim's conquest. Sorry, not conquest, I mean a mutual understanding between equals that Tiber Septim destroying the capital was chill, and Vivek is fine with not being the Alpha Guar because he reached Kim or whatever. Morrowind is unique in its past dealings with Cyrodiilic empires in that Morrowind was the only region of Tamriel that successfully resisted the Second Empire of Man, remaining independent in those times. In the First Era 2840, Emperor Remen I invaded Morrowind, starting an 80-year war that neither he nor any of his heirs would live to see resolved. In this prolonged conflict, known as the Fourscore War, the Dunmer, under the leadership of the Tribunal, fought Imperial forces to a stalemate, in which they were only able to occupy primarily House Redoran territory in the west of the province. The decisive check on Remenite forces was dealt by Vivek, who employed the use of a clever stratagem. Imperial forces marched to seize the important Redoran fortresses of Alduval and Aldmeric along Lake Coronati, which would give them a base to invade the eastern half of Morrowind. En route to the fortresses, the Legion would have to pass Bodrum and cross the Parai River, which Vivek had dammed, exposing the muddy squall of the riverbed. As the Imperials struggled in the mud, Dunmer battle mages destroyed the dam, the force of the river washing over and devastating Legion forces. While a separate Imperial force managed to take Aldmeric, the Imperial force intended to siege Alduval had been crushed by Vivek, rendering the Legion unable to take their objective. Thus, Emperor Remen III decided to reach out for a truce. Shortly before the Emperor could ratify this truce, he was suddenly assassinated by, according to Imperial records, Morag Tong assassins. The alternative theory regarding this is that, in fact, Akaviri assassins had been responsible, seeking to establish an Akaviri-dominated empire. True or not, the Akaviri did establish themselves as the new primacy in the empire, and Remen's truce was ratified by the Sayeshi Versidu She, Remen's former advisor, now potentate of the empire. As the war ended in First Era 2920, so ended the First Era as a whole. Cyrodiilic power retreated from most of Tamriel, and for over 800 years there would be no attempts to conquer Morrowind from the Imperials. That brings us to the legend himself, Tiber Septim. Emperor Tiber Septim I is probably considered the most important figure for the races of men. Known as Talos before ascending the Ruby Throne, his deeds and impacts were considered so great that he must have been a god, sent to Nirn as a mortal to raise men to the highest powers above all other peoples. Talos did not die as men do. He ascended to godhood and took his place among a pantheon of his peers. Talos came from obscure origins. Born on the northern continent of Atmora, he lived as a boy in Skyrim. Perhaps by chance, or perhaps divine fate, Talos would encounter the Greybeards, keepers of a powerful vocal-based magic called the Thu'um. They taught the powers of the Thu'um to Talos, whose ability was quickly recognized by the petty ruler of Falkreath, King Cuchulainn. While the Akaviri were able to maintain order for quite some time after the extinguishing of the Imperial line, by Second Era 430, they too would also collapse. The realms of men became fragmented, myriads of minor rulers fighting amongst themselves for what scraps remained of the old empire. King Cuchulainn, with the aid of Talos, however, broke away from the pack as they won victory after victory. Soon, scores of men flocked to their banner as the legend of the Thu'um spread. The success of Cuchulainn and Talos left them with many enemies who bade their time for a moment to strike back. In Second Era 854, our tandem completed their greatest victory yet. They had taken the Imperial city, and Cuchulainn at last able to take up the mantle and re-establish the prowess of the Ruby Throne. However, in this moment of victory, a Witchman of the Reach assassinated Cuchulainn and slit the throat of Talos. While Talos had survived the attack, his throat and voice were scarred. He could no longer utilize the power of the Thu'um. The men of Skyrim and Cyrodiil wept at the sight of their general, but not in sorrow of his wounds, but in joy, because they could now crown who they believed was their true emperor. Talos took on a Cyrodiilic name and ruled henceforth as Tiber Septim, Emperor of the Third Empire of Man. Immediately, Tiber Septim put to task restoring the former lands of the Empire, conquering all of Cyrodiil, Skyrim, High Rock, Hammerfell, Elsewhere, and many parts of Blackmarsh before setting sights on Morrowind. Tiber Septim was initially skeptical of an invasion of Morrowind. He was familiar with the history of the previous invasion. The living gods were formidable foes, and the quagmire of the failed Remen invasion was essentially responsible for the downfall of the Remen dynasty and Second Empire as a whole. Despite this, Tiber Septim elected to invade regardless for a couple key factors: a desire to unite all of Tamriel, but perhaps more importantly, to gain control over the vast quantities of ebony, glass, and Dwemer artifacts in Morrowind. On the Dunmer side of things, certain signs of an imminent invasion began to show. Large troop buildups had been observed along Morrowind's western border, and assembly of vast naval forces in Skyrim. Imperial cross-border raids and patrols had also been conducted in the south, originating from Blackmarsh. Unfortunately for the Dunmer, their unity and cohesion was abysmal compared to their ancestors during the Remen invasion. This new empire was assessed as far stronger than the previous one, and there was much bickering between the great houses over how to confront this threat. Only House Redoran, Induril, Dress, and the Temple arranged to confront the invaders. House Telvanni declared neutrality, and House Lalu instead wished to make concessions to avoid conflict. Neither would contribute towards a united front. Of those that wished to fight, they disagreed on strategy. Morrowind's western border was only defended by dilapidated militias, a few bands of mercenaries, and Redoran warriors, with a small elite contingent of Imperial ordinators and buoyant armigers. As this force was deemed inadequate, House Inderal in Dress instead opted for a guerrilla war. This strategy involved conceding vast swaths of Redoran territory, who considered this plan to be egregious and downright offensive. Upon the start of the Imperial invasion, the Redoran proved merely a roadblock, and their will to fight was quickly broken, feeling betrayed and unsupported by their fellow Dunmer. The guerrilla strategy as well proved ineffective, as it seems at this time the Dunmer nobility were unable to motivate the commoners to their cause. In fact, it's worth mentioning that a common Dunmer by the name of Symmachus actually joined the Legion during their campaign. He quickly rose through the ranks and became one of Tiber Septim's most capable generals. The Legion made steady progress, and eventually was able to capture and sack the capital city of Mournhold, whose ruling family were all slain, except for the 5-year-old future queen Baranziah. Following this disaster, much to the shock of temple patriarchs and ordinators, Vivek made a rare public appearance to announce he had signed an armistice with the Imperials. While the war had been going poorly, it is not understood why Vivek sought terms so quickly. He had fought the last Imperial invasion for 80 years, but this ongoing attack for less than 1. The tribunal narrative is that Tiber Septim was a prophesized ally of Vivek, who would in time aid the Dunmer in defeating their great enemy, the Sharmat Dagoth-ur. I've written extensively on the heresies of tribunal canon. If you want to know more, consider my separate analysis of the Tribunal Temple. To put it vaguely, it's possible the Tribunal were not as powerful as they once were, and lacked the strength to resist for very peculiar reasons. Finally, with all that out of the way, we can explore the Treaty of the Armistice itself. What does it entail specifically, and how much of a role does it play in Morrowind's government? There's 2 ways you can look at the armistice. One being a mutual agreement between more or less equal powers. Vivek and Tiber Septim deciding it would be more beneficial to be partners rather than enemies, in a war that could go on for far longer and consume a great many lives. The other way of looking at it is Morrowind cutting its losses, trying to preserve as much of its rights and autonomy as possible, instead of prolonging a conflict that would only lead to a complete defeat. It's really up to you to form your own opinion, but the Imperials have certainly formed theirs. In the words of the Imperial Magistrate Genonia Militis of the Imperial Commission in Balfoyen, the terms of the armistice are quite clear, and we are a tolerant empire. While we are in Morrowind, its laws and superstitions, as you call them, are respected as if they were those of the Imperial City itself. Murals and other art depicting Vivek as a subjugated foe and Tiber Septim as a supreme conqueror can be found in several prominent Imperial buildings in the province. This artwork in particular is supposed to represent the moment Vivek approached Tiber Septim, seeking peace with terms. Both parties agreed to cease fighting, and wider negotiations including all of the great houses and temple authorities proceeded. The final terms of the Treaty of the Armistice are as follows. The great houses of Morrowind will retain their positions of power. The Tribunal Temple will remain the preeminent religion of the Dunmer people and not be persecuted by the Empire. Dunmer rights to practice slavery will be respected. In general, almost all other Dunmer rights and privileges will be retained and respected. The Imperials received, in turn, several concessions from the Dunmer. The Empire and chartered Imperial companies gain a trade monopoly on ebony, glass, and Dunmer artifacts, which are very important military resources. Imperial guilds, like the Fighters and Mages Guild, will be permitted to operate freely in Dunmer territory, and operate guild halls if desired. Imperial trade companies will likewise be given the freedom to do business in the province. Imperial settlers will have the right to colonize and found settlements with only a few exceptions. Imperial citizens will have the right to settle in already established Dunmer cities and afforded protection of the great houses that rule those respective cities. The Empire will set up a parallel feudal system, breaking up the province into several districts controlled by dukes that pay fealty to a high king or queen appointed by the Emperor. The Empire retains the right to construct and garrison forts and naval bases in the province. Imperial intelligence and police services like the Blades are permitted to operate freely. And finally, perhaps the most important term of all, is the transfer of the Numidium, the mighty Dunmer automaton, to the Empire. It was the fear of the Numidium's potential power that led to a war between the Dunmer and Dwemer in the past. While at the time of the armistice the Numidium was derelict, Tiber Septim was able to activate it to its full potential. Not even the High Elves of the Aldmeri Dominion could resist the Numidium's power. While the Numidium would be destroyed shortly after defeating the Altmer, Tiber Septim, wielding this Dwemer superweapon, was able to complete his conquests. Imperial dominance in all corners of Tamriel was now established, and Vivek of Morrowind had delivered the weapon responsible. With the imperial influence of Morrowind confirmed and permitted by the armistice at the end of the Second Era, gradually its economic and military presence increased in the province to the point we have today. As the Hlaalu were the first and most adamant about a deal with the Empire in the first place, naturally it is their lands where imperial control is strongest. Cities like Narcissus and Balfoyen contain neighborhoods catering to imperial residents and host imperial government buildings. The Hlaalu collaborate with the Empire so closely that outlanders are allowed into some of the highest positions of their government. The Hlaalu counselor for their lands in Vardenfell is an Imperial, Crassius Curio. He's a strange figure for sure, an author of various erotic novellas and patron of explicit art. There's also some credible sexual abuse allegations from those in his service. I'm sure Hlaalu Coin and Kimono Thugs have kept evidence from reaching the public. Will someone on the Elder Council please just release the Curio files? Besides Hlaalu territory, Imperial control is very much on a spectrum. Vardenfell is a peculiar case as the Imperial footprint is as big or bigger than any of the great houses. Vardenfell was initially a temple mandate with only temple settlements permitted aside from some small pre-existing Dunmer ones. But in 3rd Era 414, with the approval of King Lethen, Vardenfell was declared open for colonization and exploitation of resources. In other areas of the province, imperial settlements tend to hug the coastline of the Inner Sea. Settlements like Firewatch, Helnum, Old Ebonheart, Tain, and more, becoming thriving towns benefiting greatly from imperial trade and military presence. In Dunmer cities as well, you can find a considerable imperial footprint. Craftsmen and merchants from all other provinces in the Empire settling down, seeking wealth and fortune in Morrowind. Outside of Hlaalu territory, away from the coast and border of Cyrodiil, evidence of imperial rule can be hard to come by. You may find the occasional fort along a trade route, or an office in a city, but in places like Necrom, one could live a whole life without seeing a legionnaire. I want to refocus on Old Ebonheart for a moment. Old Ebonheart is the shining jewel of Imperial Morrowind. It is the epicenter of imperial power in the province. It serves as the largest trade hub, religious center, and military base. de facto the imperial capital of the province. The legionnaire guarding the gate described the city to me. Old Ebonheart is a beacon of Cyrodiilic civilization in the province of Morrowind. While the lands outside are riven with ash storms and the machinations of strange gods, within these walls the cosmopolitan and enterprising spirit of the imperial culture thrives. Here the imperial cult reigns supreme, and the emperor's law is the only law. The city has prospered in this way for centuries, symbolizing progress in the land of the Dark Elves. Old Ebonheart sits on the ruins of the once great Ra'atim clan. The Ra'atim rose to rule not only their city of Ebonheart, but also Amalexia's city of Mournhold. As we already know, Tiber Septim would elevate Baranzaya Ra'atim to Queen of Morrowind. Later, other Ra'atim would marry into the imperial royal family like Kataraya Ra'atim, who served as Queen Regent and later Empress of the whole empire. Today, however, the Ra'atim clan are near extinction. Their cities over time absorbed by Imperials or Dunmer great houses. Old Ebonheart today shows almost no evidence a Dunmer city ever existed here at all. Some rumors say the Ra'atim ancestral tomb can be found below the city and still contains a great but mysterious dormant energy. The location of Old Ebonheart is significant for two main reasons. One is its access to both the inner sea and mouth of the Thur River, the most important maritime trade routes in the province. The second reason is Ebony. Old Ebonheart sits on some of the richest ebony mines in all of Tamriel. The East Empire Company in particular operates many of the mines here, and as such has their Morrowind headquarters in the city. As it turns out, Old Ebonheart must also be a notable tourist destination, as every other guard here asks the question, "Here to see the castle?" I mean, it's alright, I've seen castles before. I know it's a big one, but alright, it's a good castle. The Old Ebonheart Castle, or formerly as it's called, the Ebon Tower, is the main headquarters of the Legion and Imperial government of Morrowind. Several embassies for other provinces and great houses can be found here. The Grand Inspector of the Census and Excise Office resides here. There's also residences for the 6 Imperial Dukes for Morrowind's districts, when they feel the need to meet in council. Now you may be asking, what exactly do I mean by districts and dukes of Morrowind? Having a high king or queen makes sense, since it puts someone above the great houses, yes. But doesn't the empire rule by integrating the existing structure of those houses? Well, as usual with Morrowind, the answer is both yes and no. The empire runs a parallel nobility, which of course is a source of immense confusion and stress for lowly bailiffs or barristers that have to make it work. Not to mention for regular people who don't know who exactly to pay taxes to, which is why I choose to not pay any taxes. The Empire subdivided Morrowind into 6 districts, with the island of Vardenfell being its own, and the remaining districts roughly correlating to the respective lands of each of the 5 great houses: the Telvanus, Mournhold, Deshan, Narcissus, and Valathis districts. Each of these districts is ruled by a duke or duchess appointed by the Ruby Throne, with these lords being vassals of Morrowind's High King. Of course, as mentioned previously, this system is roughly modeled after the feudal system of Cyrodiil. To garner respect and rapport with the locals, it is seen as imperative that the imperial monarch of Morrowind be a Dunmer by blood. Many of the appointments for duchy-level nobles follow this reasoning to a degree as well. For example, The Duke of Narcissus, Fethes Lalu, and the Duke of Vardenfell, Fedem Dren, are Dunmer with ties to great houses, now elevated to imperial vassals. However, over time, many of the ducal titles have fallen out of Dunmer hands, with many Cirids holding these stations. Now, one may think this is unacceptable to the Dunmer, and for the record, it is to many of them, but of course I must once again reiterate the parallel systems of government at play. These imperial nobles hold power almost solely over the imperial colonists in Morrowind, their rule extending marginally or not at all outside of a few settlements. A great example of this is in the Telvanus district of Morrowind's northeast. When Bredami Vainth, the former Dunmer Duchess of Telvanus, died with no heirs, the Ruby Throne exercised its privilege of appointing a new lord. Instead of appointing a distant member of the Vainth family to the station, an imperial noblewoman, Perulia Jandacia, was made Duchess, and has ruled for 30 years. Duchess Jandacia's seat is the imperial town of Firewatch, an important center of trade with a large naval base. In Telvanni lands, Duchess Jandacia realistically cannot exercise power beyond a handful of imperial settlements outside of Firewatch. Helnum and Nivalis are really the only other places her rule is followed. The Duchess would be paying for her hospitality papers in Port Telvanus just like everyone else, assuming she even considers making a visit to what is theoretically her district's largest city. Back in Firewatch, the Duchess, her family, retinue, and staff take up residence in the Ember Keep. The Ember Keep functions in much the same way as the Ebon Tower does in Old Ebonheart, but on a smaller scale. Ducal seats such as this come with the addition of a knightly order. The knights of these orders are sworn to protect the life and laws of their duke or duchess, and exist as regional forces independent from the Legion. Legion troops certainly can be under the command of a duke if they're stationed in the area, but most legions have a dedicated military commander, taking orders directly from the Imperial City or Morrowind's Legion headquarters in Old Ebonheart. Next time you go to Narcissus, it's worth checking out the River Keep to see its knightly order. The Order of Narcissus have very impressive facilities. One of their knights is both a personal bodyguard of the Duke and the highest-ranked gladiator of the Narcissus arena. And you think you've accomplished a lot once you reached your 130s. Dotted all across Morrowind's frontiers and roadways is an array of Legion forts. These forts serve a myriad of purposes, like guarding provincial borders from external threats, protecting vital trade routes from banditry, delaying hostile forces in the event of an invasion, providing a secure location to detain criminals, and to guard nearby important resource-gathering operations. Fort Darius in the town of Nissus stands watch over the local Quama egg mine colony, securing for Legion troops in Morrowind access to critical staple foods. But I think you know how important the eggs are already. Going southeast a ways, staying in Vardenfell, Fort Buckmoth ensures the Redoran-run Ebony mining operation goes smoothly and follows the protocols of the armistice, it being illegal, of course, for the Redoran to sell ebony to anyone outside of the Imperials. These forts come in various sizes, hosting formidable garrisons that make up the strongest fighting force in the local area. But there are many comparably tiny forts just happy to participate. Fort Umbermoth is one of the smallest forts in Morrowind. It sits very deep in Indral territory, just outside the village of Salin, by the Patamaic coast. Umbermoth guards a portion of a small but decently traveled thoroughfare. Taking this road north leads to the sacred city of Necrom, so many Dunmer pilgrims traveling up the road from the south pass by the fort. Pilgrims, of course, are often a target of bandits and highwaymen, so the presence of an Imperial fort, no matter how small, would give any ne'er-do-well second thoughts. Patrols coming from forts like this perhaps represent Imperial rule in the most visible way to a commoner. Even if you only see one of these forts every once in a while, it just gives you that little reminder that you're the subject of a far-off foreign ruler. Checking out Fort Umbermoth reveals some issues. The isolation has caused much of the garrison, including the commander, to turn to drinking and sexual debauchery. Additional poking reveals some resentment with the locals as well. Nothing major, but worth noting. An Interal Dunmer and local of Salin, Mothis Seram, is an officer in the fort. Mothis is not on speaking terms with his family, as he joined the Legion seeking higher status. Mothis figured life as a simple guard in a quiet farm village was unsuited for his talents. So he's upgraded to being a guard at the dilapidated fort right next to that quiet farm village. Wow, joining the Legion truly opens up doors to unimaginable opportunities. The simulacrum did quite a number on many of the Empire's forts in the province. As Imperial resources strained, many of the forts fell into disrepair or had to be abandoned outright. Unfortunately, many unfriendly characters moved into some of these forts. Fort Firemoth sits on an island choke point in the Inner Sea. Once one of the largest and most important Imperial forts in the region, it's since been taken over by, well, nothing too crazy, just a powerful lich necromancer that's raised the dead legionnaires to an undead army. Yeah, don't even ask about this place. Legionnaires will shoot down most lines of questioning if you look like you can't handle yourself. Not only is it too dangerous for anyone to investigate, it's frankly an embarrassing state of affairs. Beyond land-based forts, the Empire also has a number of naval forts in Morrowind, acting as bases for logistics, administration, and maintenance of the Far East Fleet. Fort Symmachus, for instance, is the most important base in Morrowind for the East Navy. If you'd like to know more about how these bases function, I did a deep dive on the West Navy and its operation in the Cyrodiilic city of Anvil. Hopefully, this analysis of how the Empire exercises its rule in Morrowind has informed you instead of confusing you. Honestly, if you are confused, I can't blame you. Imperial control is spotty in many areas, and it's not always clear whose rules you have to follow. Are you breaking an Imperial law, but not a Dunmer law? How about breaking a Temple law? If you break an Imperial law in a Dunmer town, can the Legion come after you? Seriously, I need to know the answer. I'm in the middle of a situation. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I appreciate all the support I've received in making these videos. If you haven't already, consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment. If you want to support my work even more, check out the Patreon. A huge thank you to the Curate level patron Brandy Hutzel and all the acolytes that voted for this video to be made in a Patreon poll. Once again, thank you, and I'll see you soon.